text for this morning is John chapter 7, verses 15 to 32. I've increased our Feast of the Tabernacles series to 4 parts, as you can see. Last week I said 1 of 3, now it's 2 of 4. It's a lot of important stuff. John chapter 7, last week we looked at Jesus getting ready to go to the Feast of Tabernacles, but they wanted him to go publicly, and he only wanted to go privately. And as we ended our text last week, he had just gotten to the feast and he was preaching. And that's where we pick up our text today. In John chapter 7, verses 15 to 32. It says this. This is right after Jesus had finished speaking. And the Jews marveled, saying, "How knoweth this man the Scripture, seeing that he never learned?" Jesus answered them and said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself. He that speaketh of himself seeketh his own glory, but he that seeketh his glory that sent him, the same is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Did not Moses give you a law, and yet none of you keepeth the law? Why go ye about to kill me?" The people answered and said, "Thou hast a devil. Who goeth about to kill thee?" Jesus answered and said unto them, "I have done one work, and you all marvel. Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers. And ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. If a man on the Sabbath receive circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, be ye angry with me, because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment." Then said some of them of Jerusalem, "Is not this he whom thou go about to kill? And behold, he speaketh openly, and they say nothing to him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is indeed that Christ? Howbeit we know this man whence he is. But when that Christ cometh, no man shall know whence he is." Then cried Jesus in the temple as he taught, saying, "Ye both know me, and know whence I am. Yet am I not come of myself, but he that sent me is true, whom ye know not. For I know him, for I am of him, and he hath sent me." Then they sought to take him, but no man laid hands on him, because his hour was not yet come. Sorry, that ends at verse 30, actually. The title of our message this morning, Jesus Attends the Feast of Tabernacles, part 2 of 4. And here's our introduction. In last week's text, Jesus was encouraged by his brethren to attend the Feast of Tabernacles as a public person, and so to enhance his popularity among the Jewish nation. Jesus, of course, declined to attend the feast as a public figure, but he did arrive at the feast when it was already half over. Our text begins this morning with Jesus teaching at that feast. There are 3 points to our message this morning. In verses 15 to 19, Jesus defends his authority to the rulers, or the Jewish temple rulers. In verses 20 through 24, Jesus defends his miracle to the pilgrims. In verses 25 through 30, Jesus defends his divine origin to the locals. After Jesus arrived at the feast, he had begun to teach. Crowds began to form, and they soon interrupted Jesus' teaching by asking questions. In our text this morning, we'll notice that Jesus addresses 3 different types of Jews. First, the Jewish temple rulers in verses 15 to 19. Then Jesus will address the traveling Jewish pilgrims in verses 20 to 24. And then finally, the locals who lived in Jerusalem year-round in verses 25 through 31. It's very important to understand that Jesus is talking to 3 different crowds in the course of our text this morning. In our first point, verses 15 to 19, Jesus defends his authorities to the rulers. See, Jesus will talk differently to each of the crowds. Now he talks to the rulers. Verses 15 and 16. "And the Jews marveled, saying, How knoweth this man the Scripture, seeing that he never learned? Jesus answered them and said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me." Jesus, as you know, had been quietly teaching in the temple when rulers from the temple tried to discredit him in front of the crowd. The Jews were very upset that anyone thought that they had the right to teach who had not been taught in their own rabbinical schools. The Jews thought that no one had the right to teach without their approval and their authority. Jesus does tell them, however, that he teaches with authority, but an authority that comes from God, the Father. Jesus says that he is not the inventor of the doctrine that he teaches, but only the mouthpiece and the spokesman of the sender, who is the Father. If the Jews, therefore, want to discredit the teaching of Jesus, they should know that they're also discrediting the doctrine of the Father, because it's the Father who sent the Son to say these things. Verse 17, Jesus says this, "If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself." This can be very confusing. What you should know that in verses 17 and 18, Jesus is setting down two rules for testing the credibility of a speaker. They want to challenge his authority. He'll tell them what rules should be used to challenge his authority. First, a person can test the doctrine of the speaker to see if it is of God, the doctrine, to see it is of God. And secondly, in verse 18, a person can test the teacher's motives. So doctrine and motives, that's how you test the credibility of someone. Jesus begins by answering their murmuring speech. Jesus had just told them that the words were not his own, but they were the words of the Father who sent him. The rulers here want to know, why should we believe you when you say your words come from God? Prove to our reason that this is so. Now, Jesus is not going to fall into the trap of submitting his doctrine to the decisions of blind human reason, and neither should we. Jesus teaches that the doctrines of God are spiritually discerned and unknowable to those who have not the Spirit. In other words, you can only know a doctrine is spiritual of God by experience. The experience of having the Spirit discern truth in your mind. Now this gets a little complex. Jesus reasons that when a man is willing to do God's holy will above his own wicked will, it means that he has been made willing by God's grace, which works in us through the Word and the Spirit. In other words, a man will know that he is doing God's will by the actual experience of letting God's will move his will. When God's will supersedes human will, only then will a man know what God's will is. That's what Jesus is teaching them. And he will know by having experienced his own will being changed from something carnal to spiritual. We can only know something by experience. When our will is changed, we know that God changed our will. Only by experiencing an unnatural change in our will can this knowledge of God's will be obtained. By way of example, if you desire to sin but your will is moved from sin to Christ, you will know that it is a heavenly influence or doctrine at work. Since this doctrine to behave holy is unnatural to human flesh, it must be derived from God. When the carnal mind changes from pleasing itself to desiring to honor God, you can know for sure that God has wrought his heavenly will in you. In other words, this is what Jesus is telling them, saying to the Jews, Jewish rulers. You do not possess the spiritual tools to discern what I say. You can only interpret my spiritual words by submitting to the Holy Spirit. If you would submit to the Spirit, Jesus tells them, you would know by my teaching and my miracles that I am telling the truth. But the spiritually blind cannot see spiritual truth. And that's what Christ is telling them in his first evidence of a true speaker. Verse 18. Here's the second part. He that speaketh of himself seeketh his own glory. But he that seeketh his glory that sent him, the same is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Jesus now gives a second rule for testing the credibility of a speaker. Jesus says this, that as a general rule, when most people speak, they do so to seek their own glory. Most words are used for some selfish advantage, for some profit, for some honor, or for some attention. But when a man comes along and he seeks to advance the honor of another, it's a good sign that the person's words are sincere and faithful. This is not how fraudulent people or liars or unrighteous people speak. Doctrines that seek to advance the glory of God are most likely to be from God. This is especially true of genuine religious teaching. When a person seeks his own glory or attempts to peddle his own wisdom rather than the glory of God, he is not to be trusted. Of course, it is the Jewish rulers that invent false doctrine in their oral law and then force the people to submit to their man-made laws. Jesus, on the other hand, we're told, speaks exactly the words of the Father. So Jesus says, you want to know by what authority I do this? First of all, you can't because you don't have the Spirit. The Spirit is necessary for you to see that I'm Jesus, the Son of God. Secondly, I come advancing somebody else's message. And if it's somebody else's message, you can know it's not my message and I'm not seeking my own glory. That's what he meant in those two verses. Verse 19, now he goes on the attack. Did not Moses give you a law, and yet none of you keepeth the law? Why go ye about to kill me? As we see, in an instant, Jesus suddenly moves from giving noble axioms of how to identify the credibility of a message and a messenger to this full assault against the Jewish rulers that are standing before him. Like a bolt of lightning, Jesus charges the Jewish rulers with gross unrighteousness and gross violations of the law. When Jesus asked, did not Moses give you a law, and yet none of you keepeth the law? He charges the Jews with their worst fear, failure to honor Moses' law. For a people steeped in works righteousness, this is the equivalent of condemning their faith. They think the law is saving them and they're not keeping the law. The reader might wonder why Jesus suddenly charges these Jews with violating God's law. It is because Jesus knows their motivation is to kill him. Jesus asks, why go ye about to kill me? Let's remember, he's only talking to the rulers here. He's not talking to the general pilgrims or other Jews. Jesus' question wonders whether killing God or killing Jesus, who brings to them the doctrine of God, is a good example of keeping the law. Is murder the teaching of God's law? Jesus is asking them. Does the act of murder come from God or does it come from the devil? Of even greater significance, Jesus teaches that since he is the fulfillment of the law, it only stands to reason that someone who hates the fulfillment of the law must also hate the law itself. The Jews thought they could easily do away with Jesus by attacking his qualifications for public ministry. But Jesus exposed their real motivation, which was to murder him. By what lawful authority, Jesus asks, were they going to do that? We come to our second point, verses 20 to 24. Jesus defends his miracles to the pilgrims. Different audience now here. The people, notice it says the people and not the rulers. The people answered and said, Thou hast the devil. Who goeth about to kill thee? The people mentioned in this verse are no longer the Jewish rulers. The people who now speak up are the Jewish pilgrims who came to attend the Feast of Tabernacles. They are not the rulers, the Sanhedrin, or the temple guards. They are just people on the outside of this controversy between Jesus and the Sanhedrin. Since these pilgrims come from far away, they do not really understand the trouble that exists between Jesus and the Sanhedrin. These pilgrims had thought that the dispute between Jesus and the Sanhedrin was innocent and respectful. It never occurred to them that the Sanhedrin wished to murder Jesus. When Jesus claims that it is their goal, these pilgrims are horrified. They cannot imagine the Sanhedrin would do such a thing. This is where the people begin to turn. They admire Jesus to a certain degree until he said that the Jewish authorities wanted to murder him. They begin to believe that Jesus might have some kind of evil spirit, or a devil must be clouding his mind. Meanwhile, the members of the temple ruling class remain silent, but secretly know that Jesus has correctly interpreted their thoughts. Jesus answered and said unto them, I have done one work, and ye all marvel. Jesus is now done speaking with the rulers, and he, of course, is now addressing only the pilgrims. Jesus begins to speak about what we might call the elephant in the room, or as Jesus calls it, the one work that I have done. The reader might wonder what one work Jesus was referring to. Well, 1 year earlier, Jesus had healed a man that was a cripple for 38 years. We read that in John chapter 5. And then he had told him to carry his bedding on the Sabbath through the streets. The Jewish rulers had used this incident to discredit Jesus and question his motives. Now Jesus will address their charge. And since the Jews feel so strongly about the laws of Moses, Jesus suggests in the next verse that they should let Moses' law decide if he has done anything unlawful when he healed this lame man. Verse 22, Jesus says, Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers. And ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. Here Jesus shows the Jews that they apply the law one way for themselves and another way for him. Jesus knew their thoughts and knew they considered him a Sabbath breaker. So Jesus asked them if it is not true that they circumcise on the Sabbath. It is true that if a child was born on Friday, then 8 days later, their circumcision would fall on the Sabbath. The Jews would then circumcise on the Sabbath. And yet they charge Jesus with the violation of healing on the Sabbath when he extends a blessing far greater than circumcision. It is as if Jesus said, you know you have laws governing the Sabbath, and in it there should not be any work. But when it comes to the work of circumcising, you rightly put the Sabbath regulations to not work aside, because circumcision is no disruption of the Sabbath, but a bonus to an already holy day. It's good that they were doing that. Jesus commends them for realizing that the Sabbath should not be interrupted. It should not interrupt entering a child into covenant with God. The point is that good works, such as circumcising on the Sabbath, are no interruption to the Sabbath. Jesus then asked them to apply the same logic to his healing of the lame man on the Sabbath. Healing is a good work, and therefore it ought to be properly done on the Sabbath. It does not take away from the Sabbath, but it enhances it. Neither is it a lawful exception. It's not even an exception to the Sabbath. There's no need for an exception to do a good work. Jesus goes on, verse 23. If a man on the Sabbath receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, be ye angry with me, because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? So now Jesus pushes the argument even further. Jesus says, you must administer the rite of circumcision on the Sabbath when it falls on the 8th day, because circumcising on the 8th day is required by the law of Moses. Of course, God did know that some babies would be born on Friday and therefore have to be circumcised on Saturday. When he made the law, he knew some would be circumcised on the Sabbath. Jesus argues that circumcision is a blessing from God, and even in the Jews in the crowd would have agreed that was true. Now the path is clear for Jesus to apply the same rule to his healing of the lame man. If circumcision is a blessing received by a child on the Sabbath, should we deny a lame man the blessing of healing on the Sabbath? Jesus has a right to know why they are angry with him, as the text says. Where Moses commands the blessing of circumcision, these Jews will not permit a healing on the Sabbath. Moses required the rite of circumcision to be performed and not let the Sabbath day interfere. Yet these Jews forced the Sabbath to interfere with the healing of this lame man. If these Jews would correctly interpret Moses, they would not be angry with Jesus, but see that Moses' law is not violated by Jesus' work of healing a man. In fact, it's upheld. Verse 24, Jesus says, "Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgments." Jesus closes his argument with an admonition to these pilgrims. Let's understand, this verse is not saying that we should never judge by appearance. Nor is it saying that we should try to judge by reading a person's inner motives. It's not saying either of those things. Jesus is telling the Jews to correctly interpret the law of Moses. The law of Moses does not need an imagination to apply it. Nor is it applied differently in different cases. The Scriptures are test cases for the proper use of the law, and therefore, since we have the law and precedents or applications of that same law in the Bible, we have no right to misuse the law. Jesus simply warns that all mankind have a responsibility to rightly apply the law of God. That's what he's saying. We come to our final point, verses 25 through 30. Jesus defends his divine origin to the locals. Verse 25. Then said some of them of Jerusalem. See, that's a different audience. Some of them of Jerusalem. Is not this he whom they go about to kill? In verses 15 to 19, Jesus speaks harshly to the Jewish rulers. In verses 20 to 24, Jesus attempts to reason with a crowd of pilgrims. But here in verses 25 to 30, Jesus speaks to some local citizens of Jerusalem. These citizens of Jerusalem are much better informed than the pilgrims. They are well aware that the Jewish rulers wish to kill Jesus. They know much more than the pilgrims, who were shocked to hear that the Jews wanted to kill Jesus. So let's understand we have a different audience here. Verse 26. And behold, this is what the the locals in Jerusalem are saying. And behold, he speaketh openly, and they, that is the Jewish rulers, say nothing to him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is the very Christ? Now we read that these local citizens are shocked. They know that the Jewish rulers want to kill Jesus, even before Jesus showed up. Yet here Jesus speaks openly in public, and the local authorities do not say a thing to him or attempt to apprehend him. Jesus had closed their mouths with his argument, and now to the citizens' astonishment, their mouths remained shut. The possibility now flashes into their mind that their rulers may have changed their minds about who this Jesus is. Could it be, they wonder aloud here, that their rulers may begin to believe that this Jesus is the Messiah? Verse 27, they go on. Howbeit, say these citizens, we know this man whence he is. But when the Christ cometh, no man shall know whence he is. The citizens here begin to display their own doubt that Jesus is the Messiah. Their preconceived picture of what the Messiah will be like does not fit the Jesus that stands before them. You have to understand that there was a Jewish legend. Jewish legend stated that when the Messiah comes, no one will know where he comes from or from what family he came from. It'll be a secret coming. But they know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and lived in Galilee. Furthermore, they know that Jesus' mother was Mary and stepfather was Joseph. This reasoning that the Messiah must be shrouded in mystery is an invention that prevents them from seeing that Jesus is the Messiah. Now here's the real irony. They had this legend that the Messiah's origin would be secret. And they say, oh no, it can't be secret because we know Mary was his mother and Joseph was his father. But his origin actually is a secret. Because they don't actually understand that he came from heaven, his origin, and that he was sent by the Father. So Jesus does fulfill the idea of the secret unknown origin. But they mess it up because they say, but we know his origin because we know his family and we know what town he was born in. The irony is that no one really did know where Jesus came from, which is from heaven. So the legend had some truth to it, but they misapplied the legend. Verse 28, then cried Jesus in the temple as he taught, saying, Ye both know me, and know whence I am. Yet am I not come of myself, but he that sent me is true, whom ye know not. Jesus grows angry here at the self-satisfied manner in which these citizens attempt to dismiss the possibility that Jesus is the Messiah. Did Jesus not just tell them to not to judge superficially, and here they are judging superficially? Jesus responds with a loud voice. It says he cried out, and his cry was in response to the callousness of the citizens' reasoning. Jesus' cry as if to say, so you think you know me just because you know my family and my home on earth. These citizens are treating a very insignificant piece of information as if it had great significance. How could this little bit of information teach them enough to conclude that they know enough to know that Jesus isn't the Messiah? The fact that Jesus grew up in Nazareth reveals nothing about where Jesus came from or why. The citizens realized that if Jesus thinks he was sent from heaven, then he must be crazy, that he must have an insane imagination, and that Jesus only imagines that he was sent by God, but actually must be following some kind of phantasm of the mind. Jesus responds by telling them that his Father is no phantasm, but real, and that this real God sent him from heaven on his mission. Jesus uses the citizens' faulty reasoning and denial of his actual sending to prove that they do not know the real God at all. These citizens should have known from Scripture that Jesus met the qualifications of the Messiah and had been sent by God. The proof that they do not know God is in the fact that when God sent them his own Son, they failed to recognize that Son and the fact that God had sent him. They know a couple of minor and external things about Jesus, his hometown and his family, but with this shallow knowledge, they could never know either his person or his mission. To know these, they would have to know God, as God actually had revealed himself, and him, Jesus says, they do not know. But Jesus says in verse 29, But I know him, for I am of him, and he has sent me. While Jesus had just told the local citizens that they did not know God, he assures them that he knows God and that God did commission or send him. Jesus places his own perfect knowledge against the knowledge of these citizens. But we must remember that Jesus' knowledge is entirely different. The citizens could and should have known God from his word. But Jesus, of course, was not dependent upon the Scriptures for his knowledge of God. Jesus knows God in an immediate manner because, as he said, I am of him. The knowledge of what Jesus has of God is that which he brought with him from heaven. When Jesus says, I am of him and he has sent me, he states plainly that this God, whom the citizens do not know, Jesus knows well. For Jesus came from him, or is of him, or is equal part of the eternal Godhead. And that God did himself send and commission Jesus. Jesus has here, in the most complete way, rivaled his own knowledge against these citizens. The citizens' knowledge was empty and arrogant. It drew conclusions based on faulty deductions. Jesus' knowledge, on the other hand, was first-hand knowledge.